If you learned about any non-white women activists in the 19th century at all, you likely learned about Sojourner Truth and her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech. And that's great, but what if I told you that A, the part of her story you never learned is way more interesting, and B, she kind of never gave that speech? Now, I'll admit that was a little bit clickbaity of me because she did give a version of that speech, but most historians, myself included, agree that the speech we all know, and maybe had posters of in our classroom, guilty, was actually written by a white woman who changed Sojourner's dialect and even added entirely new phrases like "ain't I a woman" decades after the original speech. And we'll talk more about why in a few minutes. But just to get us all on the same page, let me share with you some excerpts of the most famous quotes from the alleged speech as it was published by white reformer Francis Gage in 1863. I'm going to post the text as it was published in the New York Independent, but I'm going to read it in my own voice and dialect because I don't want to rightfully get canceled. Here are some quotes that you might have heard of. "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, no one but Jesus heard. And ain't I a woman? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all on her own, all of us together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. I'm obliged to you for hearing on me, and now old Sojourner hasn't got nothing more to say." Ooh, ugh, I just felt gross reading that. It's bad. You'll realize just how bad this is in a few minutes when I show you what we think is closer to the original speech. But let's start at the very beginning and share Sojourner's entire story so that she can be more than just one horribly mistranslated speech. She was born Isabella Baumfree in 1797 into slavery in Ulster County, New York. Both her parents were within a one-generation connection with West Africa. Her father was captured in present-day Ghana, while her mother was born to parents who had been taken from Guinea. Her original enslavers were actually Dutch. Remember, the New York colony used to be New Amsterdam, so her first language was Dutch, and she spoke English with a Dutch accent her entire life. She was sold away from her parents at the age of 9, eventually ending up enslaved by John Dumont, who abused and raped her repeatedly, and his wife, Elizabeth Dumont, took that as an excuse to harass Sojourner as well. While Sojourner eventually fell in love with an enslaved man named Robert from a neighboring farm, both their enslavers found out and forbade the relationship. Robert's enslaver especially didn't want the relationship because he wouldn't own Robert's children. Dumont would, since they were born to his enslaved woman. Robert was beaten, forbidden from seeing Sojourner, and died a few years later. She eventually married an older enslaved man named Thomas and had 5 children with him. Now, by the early 1800s, the state of New York had begun the process of legislating abolition, although full emancipation in the state wouldn't come for almost 30 years. Dumont continuously promised Sojourner her freedom, but then kept backing out at the last minute. By 1826, Truth just escaped with her infant daughter, forced to leave her other children behind. In her mind, between the New York legislation promising emancipation to take effect the following year and Dumont's own assurances, Truth saw herself as already free. As she explained later, "I didn't run off, for I thought that wicked, but I walked off, believing that to be all right." She and her infant daughter ended up in the home of a white family who helped her track down and fight for her other children's freedom. Her 5-year-old son had been illegally sold into the Deep South, and Sojourner took his new Alabama enslaver to court and won, making her one of the first Black women to ever win a case against a white man in court. With her and her family's freedom secured, she became a devout Christian. And for a few years, she was actually in what I can only describe as a cult. Like, let me tell you what I learned, and you tell me if this wouldn't be a 5-part Netflix documentary today. Okay, in 1833, she was hired by a man calling himself Prophet Matthias, who identified as a leader of an obscure sect related to Judaism. He ran a communal settlement in New York where Sojourner was given a job as a housekeeper. Just 1 year after she joined, she and Matthias were accused of murdering a guy named Elijah Pearson. Pearson had earlier tried to raise his wife from the dead at her funeral, and then started calling himself Elijah the Tishbite, referencing a Hebrew prophet from Gilead? What? Yeah, so after his wife's death, he became then the main financial backer for Matthias's group, which my interpretation is that Prophet Matthias took advantage of his grief and possible mental issues to get his money, but whatever. I have no evidence to back that up, but my own feelings. Then there's this big gap in Pearson's biography for 2 years until all of a sudden he ends up in Sing Sing prison for some reason, where he eats a plate of poisoned blackberries. What in the Seneca Crane? Matthias and his housekeeper, Sojourner Truth, were accused of his murder, but Sojourner, the impeccable boss that she is, had receipts. She presented multiple letters that confirmed she could have had nothing to do with Elijah's death, and she and Matthias were acquitted. But the investigation brought up other claims about Prophet Matthias's abuse of sect members, especially his own daughter, which led to the downfall of his commune. Whew. Sojourner left, obviously, and ended up in New York City. I bet John Hamm will play Matthias in the docuseries. He'd be great. It was at this point that she changed her name to Sojourner Truth and began traveling basically as an itinerant preacher speaking about abolition. She eventually joined and lived and worked with an abolitionist and women's rights collective in Massachusetts, where she met leaders like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. She grew closer especially to Garrison as she took a job working for his brother, and William helped her publish her memoir, which had been dictated since she never learned how to write. She used the proceeds from her book to buy a house and commit her time to the broader abolition and women's rights movement. Now we get to her famous speech. Didn't I tell you her story is way too interesting for us to have never learned it? Even I didn't know most of this stuff until I was doing research for this episode. In 1851, while attending the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, she delivered her famous speech, now known as Ain't I a Woman? Now, all of this is slightly tricky for historians because her speeches were always given extemporaneously, meaning not written down. So we don't have her original transcript to go off of, but a reverend who was in attendance published his record of her remarks just 1 month later, and they do not include the ain't in question, and generally just sound very different from the famous version we all might have known. Let me now just read you some excerpts from his version of the speech. And this one I don't have to worry about being canceled at all. I want to say a few words about this matter. I'm a woman. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too if I can get it. Same girl. I am as strong as any man that is now. I can't read, but I can hear. I've heard the Bible and have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if woman upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right side up again. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and the woman who bore him. Man, where was your part? But the women are coming up blessed by God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming on him. He's surely between a hawk and a buzzard. Now, class, what do we notice about this version compared with Gage's from the beginning of the episode? Oof is right. Sojourner Truth was a brilliant woman who spoke multiple languages. She dictated her memoirs, which definitely do not read like the broken dialect we heard in the first version. Speaking of dialects, if Sojourner did speak with a unique dialect, then it would have been a Dutch accent. None of this over-exaggerated Southern ain't garbage. Also, she definitely didn't have 13 children. We know her children's names, all 5 of them. So why did Gage, a women's rights activist and abolitionist, change her words so much? Well, her version of the speech was published in 1863. Heard of it? It's a pretty important year. You know, the year the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, and Northerners, especially abolitionists, are doing everything they can to motivate the war effort so that full emancipation could be achieved. By exaggerating the trauma of her story, which was totally unnecessary, like her true story was plenty traumatic, and by turning Truth's words into a broken, childlike version, Gage, I think, was trying to heighten emotions about the desperate need to save Black people still in bondage. Honestly, her version of the speech reads like a minstrel show. You could argue her intentions were good, but man, did she pick some crazy racist means to justify the end. So let's not give Gage or her version of the speech any more airtime, because Sojourner's story doesn't just end when she walks off that stage. Truth went on to speak at countless other conventions. In one instance, she got really nervous because the speaker who came before her had done such a great job that she just sang a song. Sorry, I meant to say she sang an original composition of a song that she wrote called I Am Pleading for My People to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. She's a Renaissance woman. At a convention in 1853, when she was met with mobs of young men, she reportedly told them, quote, "You may hiss as much as you please, but women will get their rights anyway. You can't stop us neither." Remember that all of her speeches were off the cuff, making them even more impressive in my mind. Hilariously, one time when she arrived exhausted at a speaking engagement in Massachusetts, she started off with, Children, I've come here like the rest of you to hear what I have to say. That's like how I feel when I walk into my classroom on a Monday morning. Who knows what I'm going to talk about? By 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War, she was headlining conferences like the American Equal Rights Association, drawing in crowds who cheered as they came specifically to hear her speak. At the 1871 8th anniversary of Negro freedom in New York, papers reported about her speech, quote, "Seldom is there an occasion of more attraction or greater general interest. Every available space of sitting and standing room was crowded." She constantly was arguing that the movement had to use the momentum of the Civil War and emancipation to keep pushing for the rights of Black Americans and the rights of all women. And she did more than speak. She aligned her actions with her words, often supporting or joining religiously affiliated abolitionist groups or living on spiritualist utopias. She helped recruit Black troops for the Civil War, including her own grandson, who was part of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. You know this one. It's the one featured in the movie Glory. During the war, she worked in the Freedmen's Associations, assisting the newly emancipated, and she was invited to the White House by President Abraham Lincoln. While in D.C. to visit the president, she rode the streetcars to help force them to desegregate? What in the Rosa Parks? In 1870, Truth was working with the government to try to secure land grants for newly emancipated people, trying to hold them to their promise of 40 acres and a mule. But after 7 years of her hard work, the project was abandoned by the government. She still supported the Grant administration, which, for all its faults, had actually done a lot to support Reconstruction in the South. She helped campaign for his re-election and actually went to the polls to vote for Grant, knowing she would be turned away, but wanting to do it symbolically anyway. Her speeches grew to include women's rights, prison reform, the end of the death penalty. She developed friendships or working relationships with some of the greatest reformers of the day, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. Sojourner spent the last years of her life being cared for by 2 of her daughters. She died in 1883 at the estimated age of 86, and almost 1,000 people attended her funeral. In Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass himself gave her a eulogy. Quote, "Venerable for age, distinguished for insight into human nature, remarkable for independence and courageous self-assertion, devoted to the welfare of her race, she has been for the last 40 years an object of respect and admiration to social reformers everywhere." And of course, she's not the only one. We could spend hours highlighting other non-white women who contributed to the cause, but here are just a few more that you should maybe look into. Maria W. Stewart, she's actually credited with being the first woman to publicly lecture for the abolition movement. Notice, I didn't say the first Black woman, the first woman. She published pamphlets in Garrison's The Liberator and spent her later years running a freedmen's hospital in Washington, D.C. Or you have Frances Harper, who was one of the first Black women to be published in the United States in 1845. For context, she was kind of a direct contemporary of Sojourner Truth, whose famous speech was just 6 years after this. Harper supplemented her work as an abolitionist and member of the Underground Railroad by also writing fiction, publishing a collection of poems in 1854. In 1859, just 1 year before Lincoln's election, she became the first Black woman to publish a short story. Harper went on to be a leader in the Black counterparts of both the temperance movement and the suffrage movement. Remember, since many of these organizations were exclusive to white women, Black women often created their own organizations, like the National Association of Colored Women, of which Harper helped found in 1896. So even though many of the reform and rights movements of the 19th century were led officially by white women, by design, and many rights organizations specifically excluded women of color from their ranks, Black women were always there. And they weren't just poster children or tokens, even though activists like Gage sometimes tried to turn them into that. Black women were becoming the fuel and power of rights movements in the United States. Unfortunately, they won't experience future wins for the women's rights movement in the same way that white women will. Remember that when women get the right to vote in 1920, Jim Crow is still preventing the vast majority of Black women from enjoying that right. But their knowledge, experience, and ability to persist in movements that span generations is going to be exactly what's needed when we get to the golden age of the rights movements, the 1960s. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.